Today's scripture reading is John 21, verses 14 through 19. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." I don't know about you, but I love reading novels. I open them with great anticipation. In each page, I learn something new about the characters, times, places, and most importantly, the plot. Some novels are thinly veiled true stories from the author's life experiences. Others, like science fiction, present the whole new world created in the author's figments of imagination. I have to say that the most satisfying chapter of a novel is sometimes the final chapter of the book. There, I get to tie all the loose ends and finally catch up to the author, if you will. In the New Testament, there are four Gospels, as we all know: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. By the way, I sometimes wonder whether that's the best order. Why is Matthew the first? Shouldn't Mark be the first? Shouldn't Luke be the last, since it flows into Acts almost seamlessly? I'm sure some of you ask similar questions. Whatever the best order may be, Bible scholars seem to agree that the Gospel of John was recorded last. So the last chapter of the Gospel of John has the feel of that final chapter of a novel, if you will. It echoes many earlier chapters and verses of the four Gospels. It's also a fitting end. It begins with the disciples fishing in the Sea of Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee, where many of them were called by Jesus. It's also the third and possibly the last recorded encounter of the disciples with the risen Christ. It also summarizes, as you will see in this sermon, what Jesus really wants from his disciples and followers, including us. Let's turn to the text itself. The first thing you notice is verses 15 through 17 are repetitive. More or less, the same question same answer, and same command are repeated 3 times. But if you listen closely, they are slightly different from each other. I have to say, much ink and sermons, probably, have been devoted to analyzing minute differences of these repetitive verses. For example, in the "Do you love me" question, the Greek word for love is not the same each time. In verses 15 and 16, the Greek word agape was used, but in verse 17, phileo was used. As most of you know, the agape love refers to that higher form of love, sacrificial and committed love, whereas the phileo love means brotherly love, as in the city named Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. You can even see the distinction in older versions of the NIV Bible. It distinguishes them this way: "Do you love me" for phileo, and "Do you truly love me" for agape. Love versus true love. I don't know about that. But the newer NIV Bibles do away with the distinction. And it seems fewer preachers and theologians these days make a big deal out of these minute differences of it anymore. Also, neither NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, nor NASB, New American Standard Bible, makes such a distinction. I am also on the camp that the two Greek words for love are used interchangeably in our text. First, only a small fraction of English translations make a distinction between the two. Also, Simon Peter himself didn't seem to make a distinction. In fact, he used the phileo 3 times in his answers, whether asked the question using agape or phileo. So I think that settles it. The differences between the verses 15 through 17 do not end here. After Simon Peter answers affirmatively to the "Do you love me" question, Jesus tells him, "Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, and feed my sheep," respectively. So what do we make of these variations? You can look at the distinction between lambs and sheep, or between feed and take care of. Again, I'm on the camp that they pretty much mean the same thing. Let's not overanalyze the text and extract something that's not there. The main point is that the Lord repeated his question and command 3 times, perhaps for each time Simon Peter denied him. After all, it was only several days earlier that Simon Peter denied Jesus. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. At the 3rd time, the Bible records, the rooster crowed, and Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. Luke 22:61. So the repetition may have been necessary to fully restore Simon Peter. Now, having addressed the variations of verses 15 through 17, let's dive in and look at verse 15. Jesus asks Simon Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" To that we ask, "These what?" It's unclear. We can interpret this question two ways. First, more than these boats, nets, and other fishing gear, collectively, the life as a fisherman? It was Simon Peter's former life before Jesus called him to discipleship and ministry. Coincidentally, Jesus calls Simon Peter by his former name too, Simon, son of John, instead of Simon Peter. So perhaps it didn't go unnoticed by the Lord that Simon Peter had returned to his former self. Early in chapter 21, Simon Peter and other disciples had returned to their former life before they became the disciples of Jesus. So that's one possibility. Or more likely, Jesus meant, "Do you love me more than these other disciples love me?" If you think about it, this is quite a probing question. As a disciple, Simon Peter was always the first in everything and more confident than others. Simon Peter himself claimed not so long ago in Mark 14:29 that he said, "Even if all fall away, I will not." To this, Jesus replied and predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed the next morning. Jesus is asking Simon Peter if he still considered himself a better and perhaps a superior disciple than the others. Was he still self confident? What a question. Jesus didn't say, "Are you ashamed of yourself for denying me 3 times?" Or do you see that your overconfidence was foolish? No, he said, "Do you love me more than these?" Simon Peter knew what the Lord meant. How did he respond? He simply said, "You know that I love you. You know that I love you." What an all inclusive answer. By avoiding a direct answer, Simon Peter is acknowledging, "Yes, Lord, I see my overconfidence in the love for you was perhaps foolish. I can't say I love you more than anyone else. I let you down, and I let myself down." He didn't stop there. He said, "I failed you, Lord, but deep inside me, I know I love you. I also know that you know that I love you." What a fitting answer. I don't think you and I would have answered any differently. Each Sunday, we come to church and hear the same voice from the Lord that Simon Peter heard. "Do you love me?" Our answer can be one of the two main types, I think. On one hand, many of us feel we were too busy and too caught up with our daily grind and realize we didn't act like we loved the Lord. Perhaps we would have given our time more generously if we were conscious of the Lord's question that, do you love me? Perhaps we would have talked about our love for the Lord to our children, friends, and neighbors instead of engaging in long conversations about our favorite sports teams or the latest high tech gadgets. Perhaps we would have visited friends in need, prayed for those who are ill, read the Bible, and so on, if we were conscious of the Lord's question. So we would say to the Lord, Lord, I didn't act like it, but I know I love you. I hope you know that I love you too. On the other hand, some of us might, some of us were busy with volunteering and getting involved in multiple church ministries. We feel good about ourselves. We would say, Lord, my pastor will tell you that I love you. Or elder or deacon so and so will tell you that I love you. Or some of you might say, my children will tell you that I love you. Perhaps you feel that you lived your life in ways that you think are pleasing to the Lord. Let's find out from the text what is pleasing to the Lord, or to be more specific, what he commands us to do. The Lord said to Simon Peter, feed my sheep. This command is preceded by the do you love me question, to which Simon Peter answered affirmatively. So Jesus is saying that if you love me, then feed my sheep. Did Simon Peter take this command to heart? Apparently so. Let's turn to his writing in the scriptures. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 2 says, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you're willing as God wants you to be. Not greedy for money, but eager to serve. Peter took it not only as a command to himself, but also a calling to others as well, including you and me. Peter took the Lord's command to his heart in his ministry too. He was known to be a missionary, and he served as a bishop at Antioch. His life was devoted to feeding God's flock. So he indeed set a good example for us. So how do we become shepherds of God's flock? For church leaders, the answer is somewhat obvious and straightforward. You fulfill your leadership roles: preaching, teaching, praying, providing pastoral care, mentoring, etc. And remain mindful of whose flock you're caring for. It's not your flock, it's God's flock. You care for God's flock because you love God. How about others? For some, God's flock may be their own children. For others, it may be the homeless people to whom they serve meals every week. God's flock may be found at church, home, neighborhood, mission or ministry sites, workplace, or anywhere we encounter uh, people. That's not all. Even church leaders are part of God's flock. They need care themselves. Those who are in their care can in turn help feed them by encouraging, helping, giving feedback to them, praying for them, and being in fellowship with them. In a nutshell, we're all in God's flock, and we feed each other. Let's not forget that. In Matthew 4:19, Jesus encountered Simon Peter and his brother Andrew beside the Sea of Galilee and said to them, "Follow me, I will make you fishers of men." Fast forward some 3 years, in John 21:19, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Follow me," after he predicted that Simon Peter would be crucified later in his life. In 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 21, Simon Peter said, "Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." So his understanding of following Jesus is following the example of Christ. In Mark 8:37 through 38, Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it." So, following him is all of the following. First, participating in his ministry. Second, following the example of Christ. And third, denying oneself and taking up one's cross. Tradition has it that Simon Peter was crucified in Rome after he spent all his life doing what the Lord commanded, feeding God's flock. We don't often find examples like him around us anymore. So, what are some examples of those who follow Christ? The best example, the most recent example I have read about is this. I read about a story about a couple who adopted babies other families did not want. These babies had birth defects. And so this couple adopted them and loved them and cared for them. Most couples would want so-called perfect babies, healthy babies. What drove them to adopt babies no one else wanted? Perhaps they saw the stark difference between a long waiting list for healthy babies and none for these other babies. And they felt compelled to respond in the way they can. In doing so, they denied themselves opportunities to adopt healthy babies and took up the cross, if you will, or the burden of a lifelong sacrifices and care. I can't think of a better example of denying oneself and taking up one's cross than this. So, in the last chapter of John's Gospel, what does the Lord ask of us? First, he asks us if we love him. Isn't it a great question we should ask ourselves every day? Did I live my life as if I loved the Lord? Did I not act like I was ashamed of the gospel? If the Lord found it worth repeating this question to Simon Peter 3 times, I don't mind being asked the same question every day. Do you? He wants us to feed his flock if we loved him. So, another question we should ask ourselves is, am I feeding his flock? Yes, some of us are doing a lot of volunteering for the church, singing in the choir, weekly cleaning, etc. And we spend a lot of time with our church friends, but are we paying attention to God's flock? Are we taking care of his sheep? It's a great question to ask ourselves. Lastly, are we following Christ? Do we not equate knowing Bible stories and understanding theology to following Jesus and feel confident that we are his disciples? Do we know what it means following him is? Are we willing to suffer anything for the Lord or the gospel? This last chapter of the Gospel of John challenges us in our daily lives. As we ponder this final chapter of the four Gospels, we have a clear understanding of what the Lord wants from us and commands us to do.